The summer sun beat down on the Montana prairie like God's own forge, but Lillian Ellis couldn't feel its warmth through the chill that had settled in her bones. She clutched the letter in her trembling hands, reading it for the 10th time since the stagecoach had delivered her to this dusty frontier town. 4 years had passed since she'd last seen these rolling plains, since she'd fled with a secret growing inside her, a secret with Grant Hawkins' eyes. It was 1878, and Lillian had returned to Broken Ridge with their daughter. She'd never told him about Abigail, never found the courage to write the words that would have changed everything. But her father's recent passing had left her with no choice but to return to the only other place she'd ever called home. "Mama, are we there yet?" Abigail's small voice piped up from beside her, her dark curls so like her father's dancing in the breeze. "Almost, my love." Lillian adjusted her bonnet against the glare. The town had grown since she'd left, new buildings stretching down the main street, but the distant mountains remained unchanged, eternal sentinels over the changing landscape below. The stagecoach driver set down their trunks outside the White Rose Inn. "That'll be all, madam. Welcome to Broken Ridge." Lillian paid him and took Abigail's small hand in hers. "Come along, sweetheart." The innkeeper, Mrs. Dalton, hadn't changed a bit, her gray hair still pulled into a severe bun, her eyes sharp but kind. "Lillian Ellis, land's sakes, girl, is that really you?" The older woman embraced her warmly. "We thought we'd never see you again after you left for Boston." "Life has a way of bringing us full circle, Mrs. Dalton." Lillian smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "This is my daughter, Abigail." Mrs. Dalton's gaze flicked between mother and child, understanding dawning in her weathered face. "I see," she said softly. "She has her father's eyes, doesn't she?" Lillian stiffened. "We'd like a room, please, just for a few nights until I can make arrangements at my father's property." As Mrs. Dalton led them upstairs, she spoke over her shoulder. "You should know, Lillian, that Grant Hawkins still runs the Double H Ranch, never married, though plenty tried to catch his eye." Lillian's heart stuttered. "I'm not here to disrupt anyone's life, Mrs. Dalton. I'm simply here to settle my father's affairs." "Affairs of the heart are rarely simple, dear." The innkeeper opened the door to a clean, modest room, especially when there's a child involved. Later that evening, after settling Abigail to sleep, Lillian stood by the window, watching the distant glow of lanterns along the main street. Tomorrow, she would need to visit her father's lawyer, begin the process of selling the Ellis homestead. She couldn't stay not with Grant so near. The memory of their last night together still burned bright in her mind. The harvest dance, his hands warm on her waist as they moved together under the stars. The whispered promises as they stole away to the creek that ran through his family's property. The way he'd begged her to stay when she'd told him she was leaving for Boston, how she'd lied about her reasons, claiming a sick aunt who needed care rather than admitting the truth that her father was sending her away because he'd discovered their relationship and deemed Grant Hawkins unworthy of his daughter. She hadn't known she was carrying Grant's child when she'd boarded that eastbound train. By the time she realized, she was already established in Boston, already shouldering the burden of her fallen status among her aunt's sympathetic but judgmental social circle. And by then, her pride and fear had sealed her lips. What if Grant rejected her? What if he'd already moved on? So she'd raised Abigail alone, working as a seamstress, telling her daughter stories of Montana skies and brave cowboys, but never speaking the name of the man who had given Abigail her dark curls and deep blue eyes. Morning came too quickly. Lillian dressed Abigail in her best frock, a pale blue cotton that matched her eyes, and prepared to face the town that had once been her home. "Remember what I told you, Abigail," she said as they descended the inn staircase. "If anyone asks about your father, I know, Mama," the child replied with a solemnity beyond her years. "My papa is in heaven with the angels." The lie tasted bitter on Lillian's tongue, but she nodded. It was simpler this way, cleaner. She would sell her father's property, use the money to establish them somewhere new, perhaps Denver or San Francisco, somewhere Grant Hawkins would never find them. But fate had other plans. They had barely reached the lawyer's office when Lillian heard a familiar voice call out behind her. deep, resonant with that slight drawl that had always made her heart race. Lillian Ellis, is that you?" She froze, her hand tightening around Abigail's. Slowly, she turned to face the man she'd loved and left, the man who didn't know he was a father. Grant Hawkins stood in the dusty street, tall and broad-shouldered in his worn denim and leather vest. The years had added lines around his eyes and a weathered quality to his sun-browned skin, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that Abigail had inherited, were unchanged, wide with shock as they took her in. "Hello, Grant," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He moved toward her like a man in a dream, removing his hat to reveal hair as dark as midnight, just beginning to silver at the temples. 4 years, he said softly. 4 years without a word. I know. She couldn't meet his gaze. I'm sorry. His attention shifted to Abigail, who was watching him with unconcealed curiosity. Something flickered across his face, confusion, then the beginning of a question. "And who might this young lady be?" he asked, his voice gentle as he knelt to Abigail's level. Before Lillian could intervene, Abigail extended her small hand with the perfect manners she'd been taught in Boston. "I'm Abigail Ellis. I'm 3.5 years old." Grant shook her hand solemnly, but his eyes darted up to Lillian's face, a quick calculation visible in his expression. 3.5, 9 months after Lillian had left Broken Ridge. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Abigail," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "I'm Grant Hawkins. I knew your mother a long time ago. Are you a real cowboy?" Abigail asked, eyeing his dusty boots and the revolver at his hip. A smile tugged at his lips. "I reckon I am. Mama tells me stories about cowboys. They're very brave." Grant stood, his eyes never leaving Lillian's face. "Does she now?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken accusations. "Well, I'd love to hear those stories sometime." "We really must be going," Lillian interjected, tugging Abigail toward the lawyer's office. "We have an appointment." "Lily," Grant said, the old nickname stopping her in her tracks. "We need to talk." She nodded stiffly. "Later, perhaps. We're staying at the White Rose." As they entered the lawyer's office, Lillian could feel Grant's eyes boring into her back. She had known this moment might come, had dreaded it for years, but now that it had, she felt strangely hollow. The lie she'd lived with for so long was crumbling around her, and she didn't know if she could bear what would be left when the dust settled. Mr. Thornton, her father's lawyer, was a balding man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He greeted Lillian warmly, offered Abigail a peppermint stick from a jar on his desk, and proceeded to explain the details of Ellis' property. "Your father's will is quite straightforward, Miss Ellis. The homestead and all its contents are yours, as is the sum of $2,000 he had saved." Lillian blinked in surprise. $2,000. I had no idea father had put aside so much. "He was a frugal man," Mr. Thornton said with a small smile. "And after you left, he had few expenses. He spoke of you often, you know. I think he regretted the circumstances of your departure." A lump formed in Lillian's throat. Her father had been a hard man, rigid in his beliefs and expectations. His disapproval of Grant, a rancher's son with little formal education and no fortune, had been immediate and absolute. But in his final letter, received just weeks before his death, he had asked for forgiveness. Too little, too late, she had thought at the time. Now she wasn't so sure. "I'd like to visit the homestead today, if possible," she said. Mr. Thornton handed her a set of keys. "Of course." "Everything is as he left it. Will you be staying in Broken Ridge then?" "No," Lillian said firmly. "I intend to sell as soon as possible and return east." Mr. Thornton's eyebrows rose. "I see. Well, there may be interested buyers, though property isn't moving quickly these days." "The railroad bypassed us for Millersville, as you may have heard." Lillian hadn't heard, but she nodded anyway. It didn't matter. She would sell for whatever she could get, as long as it meant she could leave before Grant Hawkins had time to append her carefully constructed life. They left the lawyer's office with a promise to return the following day to discuss potential buyers. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, Lillian was relieved to see no sign of Grant. Perhaps he'd gone back to his ranch, decided that whatever they had to say to each other could wait. "Can we see our house now, Mama?" Abigail asked, skipping alongside her, the peppermint stick clutched in her small hand. "It's not our house, sweetheart. It was your grandfather's house and we're going to sell it to someone else. But I want to see it." "You said it had a big tree for climbing and chickens in the yard." Lillian sighed. She had told Abigail stories of her childhood home, painting a picture of rural idyll that was more memory than reality. The Ellis homestead had been modest at best, a two-room cabin with a lean-to kitchen, 10 acres of hardscrabble land that had never yielded much beyond subsistence. "All right," she conceded. "We'll visit today, but don't get too attached. We won't be staying." They hired a buggy from the livery stable, and Lillian drove the familiar road out of town, past the church where she'd sung in the choir every Sunday, past the schoolhouse where she'd learned her letters, and finally onto the narrow track that led to her childhood home. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, its log walls weathered gray, the vegetable garden overgrown with weeds. But the old oak still stood in the yard, its massive branches spreading shade across the porch where her mother had once shelled peas and told stories on summer evenings. "Is this it, Mama? Is this where you lived when you were little like me?" Abigail bounced on the buggy seat, her face alight with excitement. "This is it," Lillian confirmed, helping her daughter down. "This is where I grew up." They explored the cabin together, Abigail wide-eyed at the stone fireplace, the braided rug her mother had made years ago, the shelf of books that had been Lillian's escape from the isolation of frontier life. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, but otherwise unchanged, as if waiting for her return. In her father's bedroom, Lillian found a small wooden box on the dresser. Inside were her letters sent from Boston over the years. Alongside them was a daguerreotype she'd never seen before, herself as a child, sitting on her mother's lap, her father standing behind them with a rare smile on his face. She tucked it into her pocket, a tangible piece of a past she'd almost forgotten. They spent the afternoon cleaning, airing out the musty rooms, Abigail helping by carrying small items from one place to another with solemn importance. By late afternoon, Lillian was exhausted but satisfied. The cabin was livable now, though she had no intention of staying more than a few days. "Can we go see the creek, Mama?" Abigail asked as Lillian hung the last of the laundered curtains. "You said there was a creek with frogs and shiny stones." Lillian hesitated. The creek, where she and Grant had spent so many stolen hours. Where they had promised each other forever on that last night before everything fell apart. "Not today, sweetheart. It's getting late, and we should head back to town for supper." But Abigail's face fell in such disappointment that Lillian found herself relenting. "All right, but just for a little while. Stay where I can see you and don't get your dress wet." The path to the creek was overgrown but still visible, winding through stands of aspen and cottonwood. The familiar burble of water over stones reached them before they broke through the trees to the small clearing where the creek widened into a shallow pool. Abigail squealed with delight and ran ahead, dropping to her knees at the water's edge to peer at minnows darting among the rocks. Lillian watched her, a bittersweet ache in her chest. This place held so many memories: her first kiss at 16, stolen during a church picnic, learning to swim one scorching July day, and later, much later, lying in Grant's arms under a canopy of stars, believing that nothing could ever separate them. She was so lost in memory that she didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were almost upon her. Turning, she saw Grant dismounting from a sturdy bay gelding, his expression unreadable as he secured the horse to a low branch. "I thought I might find you here," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. Abigail looked up from her exploration, her face brightening. "It's the cowboy, Mama, the one from town." Grant's eyes fixed on the child, then moved to Lillian, waiting for an introduction that didn't come. Finally, he crossed to where Abigail knelt by the water. "Finding any treasure?" he asked, crouching beside her. "I found a blue stone and 3 water bugs," she reported seriously. "And I saw a frog, but he jumped away." "Well, that's quite a haul." Grant smiled, and Lillian's heart clenched at the sight. He'd always been good with children, patient and genuinely interested in their small concerns. "You know, when your mama and I were young, we used to catch crawdads in this very spot." Abigail's eyes widened. "What's crawdads?" "Little creatures like tiny lobsters. They hide under rocks. Want me to show you how to find them?" She nodded eagerly, and Grant began demonstrating how to carefully lift stones to reveal the small crustaceans beneath. Abigail watched, fascinated, then squealed with delight when she successfully caught one herself. Lillian stood apart, watching them, unable to ignore the picture they made father and daughter, so alike in their serious concentration, their sudden brilliant smiles. She had denied them both this connection for years. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her like a physical burden. When Abigail wandered a little upstream, still hunting crawdads but within sight, Grant straightened and turned to Lillian. "When were you going to tell me?" He asked, his voice low but intense. "Were you ever going to tell me?" Lillian wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm evening. "I don't know," she admitted. "I wanted to at first. I wrote you a dozen letters and burned them all." "Why?" The single word contained years of hurt, of confusion. "Why would you keep my child from me?" "Because I was scared," the words burst from her. "Scared of what my father would do if I came back, scared you'd reject us, scared you'd moved on." "Moved on?" Grant's laugh was harsh, disbelieving. "Lily, I loved you. I wanted to marry you. You were the one who left without a backward glance." "That's not fair," she whispered. "My father gave me no choice. He threatened to have you run out of town, to spread rumors that would ruin your family's ranch. So you left to protect me." Grant's expression softened slightly. "You should have trusted me, Lily. We could have faced him together." "I was 18 and terrified, and then when I realized I was expecting Abigail," she shook her head. "By then, it seemed too late. Too much time had passed." "I thought you'd hate me for keeping it from you." "I could never hate you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I've missed 3 years of my daughter's life, years I can never get back." The truth of his words struck her like a physical blow. She had robbed them, both Grant of his child, Abigail of her father, all because of fear and pride. "I'm sorry," she said, the words wholly inadequate. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." Before Grant could respond, Abigail came running back, her hands cupped around something. "Look what I found, Mr. Grant. It's a crawdad with babies." Grant knelt to examine her find, his face transforming with genuine interest. "That's a mama crawdad, all right. See how she's carrying her eggs under her tail. We should put her back so her babies can grow up in the creek." Abigail nodded solemnly and gently returned the crawdad to the water. "Will she be a good mama to her babies?" "The best," Grant assured her. "Crawdad mamas are very protective." His eyes met Lillian's over Abigail's head, and the message in them was clear. Unlike some mothers who keep fathers from their children. "It's getting late," Lillian said, unable to bear his scrutiny any longer. "We should head back to town before dark." "I'll escort you," Grant said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "These roads aren't safe for a woman and child alone." The ride back to town was tense, with Abigail chattering happily from her perch on the buggy seat between them, oblivious to the undercurrents of emotion flowing between the adults. Grant rode alongside, occasionally answering Abigail's questions about his horse, his ranch, the coyotes that sometimes howled in the hills at night. By the time they reached the White Rose Inn, dusk was falling, the western sky painted in shades of amber and rose. Grant helped them down from the buggy, his hand lingering on Lillian's waist a moment longer than necessary. "I'll come by tomorrow," he told her quietly as Abigail ran ahead to greet Mrs. Dalton on the porch. "We have more to discuss." Lillian nodded, knowing she couldn't avoid this conversation forever. "Tomorrow, then." But as she watched him ride away, his straight back silhouetted against the dying light, she wondered what she could possibly say to make right the years of wrong she had done him. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay awake long after Abigail had drifted off, her mind cycling through memories and regrets. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would tell Grant everything, the full truth of her father's threats, her fear, her shame at having nowhere to turn when she discovered her pregnancy. And then, if he could find it in his heart to forgive her, perhaps they could forge some kind of arrangement for Abigail's sake, but she wouldn't stay in Broken Ridge. Couldn't stay. There were too many ghosts here, too many painful memories. The morning brought a clear sky and the promise of another scorching day. Lillian dressed Abigail in her lightest frock, then herself in a simple muslin dress that had seen better days. They would return to the homestead today, continue the work of sorting through her father's belongings in preparation for the sale. They had just finished breakfast when Grant appeared at their table, hat in hand, his hair still damp from washing. "Morning, ladies," he said, his smile cautious but genuine. "I thought I might offer you a ride out to the Ellis place, save you the livery fee." Before Lillian could refuse, Abigail clapped her hands in delight. "Can we ride on your horse, Mr. Grant? A real cowboy horse," Grant chuckled. "I brought the wagon, actually. More comfortable for you and your mama." They set off under the watchful eyes of Mrs. Dalton and several other townspeople who had paused in their morning routines to observe this unexpected tableau. Lillian felt their curious stares, knew the gossip that would follow. Unmarried mother returns with child who looks suspiciously like Grant Hawkins. The scandal would be all over town by nightfall. "People are staring," she murmured as Grant helped her onto the wagon seat. "Let them," he replied, settling Abigail between them. "I've never much cared what this town thinks of me." The drive to the homestead was easier in Grant's well-sprung wagon than it had been in the hired buggy. Abigail peppered him with questions about everything. They passed the pronghorn antelope grazing in a distant field, the hawks circling overhead, the windmill that creaked as they passed the Peterson farm. Grant answered each query with the patience of a born teacher, explaining about animal habits and how windmills work to pump water from deep underground. Watching them, Lillian felt a fresh wave of guilt. This should have been their life for the past 3 years. Abigail growing up with a father who clearly would have adored her, learning about the land and its creatures from a man who knew them intimately. At the homestead, Grant unhitched the horses and turned them loose in the small paddock while Lillian and Abigail went inside. The cabin felt different today, warmer, more welcoming now that the dust had been cleared away and fresh air had circulated through the rooms. "What would you like me to do?" Grant asked when he joined them, filling the doorway with his broad-shouldered presence. Lillian gestured to a pile of wooden crates. "I'm sorting what to keep, what to sell with the property, and what to donate to the church. If you could take those books down from the high shelves, I'd be grateful." They worked together in a companionable silence broken only by Abigail's occasional commentary as she explored the cabin's nooks and crannies. Grant moved efficiently, his strength making light work of tasks that would have taken Lillian hours. By midday, they had made significant progress, the cabin's contents neatly categorized and boxed. "Let's take a break," Grant suggested, wiping sweat from his brow. "I brought some food in the wagon. We could have a picnic by the creek where it's cooler." The idea of returning to their creek sent a flutter of anxiety through Lillian's chest, but Abigail was already bouncing with excitement at the prospect. "Can we, Mama? Can we catch more crawdads?" Lillian relented, and soon they were settled in the dappled shade by the water's edge, a cloth spread with bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of Mrs. Dalton's famous pickles. The creek gurgled peacefully, the occasional splash of a jumping fish or the buzz of dragonflies the only interruption to the summer stillness. Abigail ate quickly, then asked permission to wade in the shallow part of the creek. Lillian made her remove her shoes and stockings, roll up her dress, and promise not to venture deeper than her knees. As they watched her play, Grant spoke quietly. "She's beautiful, Lily, smart too, and brave." "She's very much like you," Lillian admitted, "not just in looks. She has your curiosity, your stubbornness." "Does she know about me, that I'm her father?" Lillian shook her head. "I told her that her father died before she was born. It seemed simpler." Grant's jaw tightened, but he didn't lash out as she half expected. Instead, he asked, "And now? Will you tell her the truth?" "I don't know how," Lillian confessed. "How do I explain why I kept her from you all these years? She's too young to understand the complexities." "Children understand more than we give them credit for," Grant said, "and they forgive easily if we're honest with them." "And you?" Lillian dared to meet his eyes. "Can you forgive me, Grant?" He was silent for a long moment, watching Abigail as she carefully placed stones to create a tiny dam in the creek. "I'm trying," he said finally. "I understand why you left. Your father made that clear enough when I came looking for you, but keeping my child from me, that's harder to forgive." "My father spoke to you." This was news to Lillian. "When?" "The day after you left." I rode to your place, half out of my mind with worry when you didn't meet me as planned. Your father met me with a shotgun, said you'd gone east and wanted nothing more to do with an uneducated cowpoke. Lillian gasped. That's not true. I wanted to say goodbye, but he wouldn't let me. He threatened to ruin your family if I contacted you. I figured as much, Grant said grimly. Richard Ellis never thought I was good enough for his daughter, but that doesn't explain why you didn't write once you were safely in Boston, especially after you discovered you were carrying my child. I was ashamed, Lillian admitted, tears stinging her eyes. Unwed, pregnant, disgraced, and afraid that you'd moved on, found someone else. The longer I waited, the harder it became to reach out. Grant's hand covered hers where it rested on the picnic cloth. I waited for you, Lily. For months, I rode into town every day to check for a letter. I even saved up enough to buy a train ticket east, but I didn't know where to find you. Your father wouldn't give me your aunt's address. The warmth of his calloused palm against her skin sent a familiar tremor through Lillian. For a moment, she was 18 again, her whole future stretching before her, full of possibility and promise. I'm so sorry, she whispered, for everything. He squeezed her hand once, then released it. What happens now, Lily? You said you're planning to sell the homestead and leave. Take my daughter away again. I don't know, she admitted. I came here intending to sell quickly and return east, but now, stay, Grant said simply. Stay in Broken Ridge, let me know my daughter, let her know me. And do what? I have no means of support here. The town needs a seamstress. Mrs. Dalton mentioned your skill with a needle. Lillian was surprised. You've been discussing me with Mrs. Dalton. Grant's smile was wry. I may have asked a few questions last night after seeing you and Abigail. The whole town knows you're back, Lily. And they know or suspect that Abigail is mine. All the more reason to leave, Lillian argued. I won't have her subjected to whispers and judgment. This isn't Boston, Grant countered. People here are more concerned with whether you can pull your weight than with who your parents are or whether you've made mistakes. Give us a chance, Lily. Before she could respond, a splash and a cry from the creek had them both on their feet. Abigail had slipped on a mossy rock and fallen into the water. She wasn't in danger, the creek was barely knee-deep, but she was soaked and wailing more from surprise than pain. Grant reached her first, scooping her up in his strong arms. There now, little lady, you're all right. Just a bit wet, that's all. Abigail's sobs subsided as Grant carried her back to their picnic spot. Lillian fussed over her, checking for injuries, finding nothing worse than a scraped knee and wounded pride. I fell down, Abigail informed them solemnly. So you did, Grant agreed, producing a handkerchief to dab at her knee. But you're a brave girl, aren't you? Hardly cried at all. Did you fall down when you were little, Mr. Grant? More times than I can count, he assured her. Once I fell out of that very oak tree in your grandpa's yard and broke my arm. Abigail's eyes widened. Did it hurt? Something fierce. But your mama was there, we were just about your age, and she ran all the way to town to fetch the doctor. Lillian remembered that day. She'd been terrified, certain Grant was dying from the way he'd gone so white and still after the fall. She'd run until her lungs burned, her braids flying behind her, desperate to save her best friend. You were my hero that day, Grant told Lillian, his eyes warm with the memory. You were always getting into scrapes, she reminded him. Someone had to look out for you. As Abigail's dress dried in the summer heat, they told her stories of their childhood adventures, carefully edited versions that omitted their later romance, but painted a picture of a lifelong friendship. Abigail listened, enthralled, occasionally asking questions or demanding more details about particularly exciting episodes. Did you and Mama get married? She asked suddenly, with the directness of a child who hasn't yet learned social filters. Grant's eyes met Lillian's over Abigail's head. No, sweetheart, we didn't, he said carefully. Why not? Mama says people who love each other get married. The innocent question hung in the air, loaded with implications neither adult was prepared to address. Sometimes, Lillian began, choosing her words with care, grown-ups make mistakes. They let fear or pride get in the way of what they want. Like when I'm scared to pet Mr. Peterson's big dog even though I want to, Abigail asked, trying to understand. Grant laughed softly. Something like that, yes. The sun was beginning its westward descent when they finally packed up their picnic and headed back to the cabin. Abigail's dress had dried, but her energy was flagging after the excitement of the day. By the time they reached the homestead, she was yawning widely. "Why don't you put her down for a nap while I finish up with those crates?" Grant suggested. Lillian nodded gratefully and led a sleepy Abigail to the bedroom, settling her on the narrow bed that had once been her own. The child was asleep almost instantly, her dark curls spread across the pillow, one small hand tucked beneath her cheek. When Lillian returned to the main room, Grant was standing by the fireplace, examining a daguerreotype on the mantel. It showed Lillian at 16, formally posed in her Sunday best, her expression serious as was proper for photographic portraits. "You've hardly changed," he said without turning. "Still the prettiest girl in the territory." "Flatterer," she accused lightly, but warmth spread through her at the compliment, "just speaking the truth." He replaced the image and turned to face her. "Lily, I need to know what you're planning. Are you still set on leaving?" She sank into her father's rocking chair, suddenly weary. "I don't know. Everything's changed since yesterday. I came here thinking I could settle my father's affairs and leave without complications. And now I see what I've denied Abigail, a father who would have loved her, a place where she belongs." She met his gaze squarely. "What do you want, Grant?" "I want to know my daughter," he said without hesitation. "I want to be her father in more than just blood, and I want—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I want a chance to see if what we had is still there, underneath all the hurt and the years apart." Lillian's heart stuttered. "You can't possibly still have feelings for me, not after what I did." "I never stopped loving you, Lily. I was angry, yes, hurt beyond words, but love doesn't just disappear because someone hurts you." "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered. "Let alone your love." Grant crossed to her, kneeling before the rocking chair to take her hands in his. "Maybe not, but you have it anyway, both." "Grant, listen to me, Lily. We've lost 3 years. 3 years we can never get back. I don't want to lose another day, stay in Broken Ridge. Give us a chance to be a family." The word family caught in Lillian's chest like a physical thing. Family. Something she'd believed forever out of reach after her father's rejection, her mother's early death, her status as an unwed mother in judgmental Boston society. What would people say? She asked, voicing her smallest concern first. Grant's laugh was gentle. "Since when do you care what people say?" The Lily I knew had opinions of her own and wasn't shy about sharing them. That Lily didn't have a child to protect, and now she has a father to help her do the protecting. Grant's thumbs traced small circles on her palms. "Stay, Lily, not at the inn, not at this old cabin. Come to the Double H, there's plenty of room, and my mother would be over the moon to meet her granddaughter." "Your mother," Lillian breathed. "Oh God, what must she think of me?" "She thinks you were a young girl pressured by a controlling father, and she's been after me for years to find you and bring you home." "You told her about us, about Abigail?" Grant nodded. "After your father died and I heard you might be returning, I told her everything. She's prepared a room for Abigail already, filled it with toys and books. She's determined to spoil her only grandchild rotten." The image of stern but kind-hearted Martha Hawkins preparing for a grandchild she'd never met brought fresh tears to Lillian's eyes. "I've been so wrong about so many things." "Then be right about this one thing," Grant urged. "Stay." Lillian looked into the eyes of the man she'd never stopped loving despite her best efforts to forget him. "All right," she whispered. "We'll stay for Abigail's sake." "For Abigail," Grant agreed, but his eyes said, "and for us." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Lillian continued sorting through her father's belongings, but now with a different purpose. Rather than preparing everything for sale, she was deciding what to keep, what to bring to her new home at the Double H Ranch. New home. The phrase still felt foreign on her tongue, a dream she hadn't dared to entertain. Grant rode into town to speak with Mr. Thornton about the homestead. Rather than selling it outright, they agreed to lease the property to a young couple just arrived from Minnesota, newlyweds, eager to start their life together, but short on funds. The arrangement would provide Lillian with a modest but steady income while giving the young couple a chance to establish themselves before having to purchase property. On their third evening in Broken Ridge, Grant invited Lillian and Abigail to dine at the town's only restaurant, a small establishment attached to the hotel that served surprisingly good beefsteak and apple pie. As they ate, Grant broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "We need to tell Abigail the truth," he said quietly, while the child was distracted by the remains of her pie. "About who I am to her." Lillian nodded, her stomach knotting with anxiety. "I know, but how? What do we say?" "The truth, as simply as we can put it. That I'm her father, that we loved each other but were separated, and now we've found each other again." "What if she's angry with me for lying?" Grant covered her hand with his own. "She's 3, Lily. She'll be confused at first, maybe upset, but children are resilient. And she already likes me, that's half the battle won." So after dinner, they took a short walk to the town square, where a small gazebo offered privacy and a bench where they could sit together. The evening was mild, the western sky painted in watercolors of pink and gold as the sun made its slow descent. Abigail was fascinated by a family of ducks in the small pond, but eventually joined them on the bench when Grant called her over. "Abigail," Lillian began, her throat tight with emotion. "Mr. Grant and I have something important to tell you." The child looked between them, her blue eyes Grant's eyes wide and curious. "What is it? Is it a secret?" "Not anymore," Grant said gently. "You see, Abigail, a long time ago your mama and I were very much in love, like in a fairy tale." Abigail asked. Lillian smiled despite her nervousness. "Something like that, but then we were separated and I went far away to Boston. And I didn't know," Grant continued, "that your mama was going to have a baby. That baby was you, Abigail." Abigail's brow furrowed as she processed this information. "So are you my papa?" Grant nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. I'm your father, Abigail, but Mama said my papa was in heaven with the angels." Lillian swallowed hard. "I'm sorry I told you that, sweetheart. It wasn't true, I was scared and confused and I made a mistake." "A very big mistake," Abigail said gravely, echoing a phrase Lillian often used when teaching her right from wrong. "Yes," Lillian admitted, "a very big mistake. I should have told you about your father, and I should have told him about you. Can you forgive me?" Abigail considered this, her small face scrunched in concentration. Then she turned to Grant. "If you're my papa, does that mean I can call you Papa instead of Mr. Grant?" Grant's voice was rough with emotion when he answered. "I'd like that very much, Abigail. And will you live with us and tuck me in at night and teach me to ride a horse like a real cowboy? All of that and more," Grant promised, "if that's what you want." Abigail's response was to launch herself into Grant's arms, nearly knocking him off the bench with the force of her small body. "I always wanted a papa," she confided into his shirt front. "The other girls at school had papas who brought them candy and took them fishing." Grant's arms closed around his daughter, and when he looked at Lillian over Abigail's dark curls, there were tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered cheeks. "I'll bring you all the candy you can eat," he told Abigail, "and teach you to fish and ride and rope a calf." "What's a calf?" Abigail asked, still nestled against him. "A baby cow. I have lots of them at my ranch at our ranch. Would you like to see them tomorrow?" Abigail nodded enthusiastically, then turned to Lillian. "Can we, Mama? Can we go to Papa's ranch tomorrow?" The word Papa on her daughter's lips sent a wave of emotion through Lillian, relief, joy, and lingering guilt all mingled together. "Yes, sweetheart, we can go to the ranch tomorrow. In fact, we're going to live there." "Forever and ever," Lillian met Grant's gaze. "We'll see," she said softly. "For now, at least." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with just a hint of autumn crispness in the air. Lillian packed their few belongings, leaving most of her father's possessions to be dealt with later. The important things, the family Bible, her mother's wedding ring, the daguerreotypes of her parents, were carefully wrapped and placed in her trunk. Grant arrived just after breakfast, driving a smart buggy pulled by a matching pair of bays. "Ladies," he greeted them with a tip of his hat. "Your chariot awaits." Abigail was beside herself with excitement, running circles around the buggy and peppering Grant with questions about the ranch, the horses, whether there would be other children to play with. "My foreman's got 3 youngsters about your age," Grant told her as he loaded their trunks. "And my mother, your grandmother, is counting the minutes until she meets you." The drive to the Double H took them west of town, through rolling grasslands dotted with stands of cottonwood and aspen. After about 5 miles, they crested a hill and Grant reined in the horses. "There it is," he said, pride evident in his voice. The Double H. Below them spread a verdant valley, bisected by a winding creek, a larger version of the one that ran through the Ellis property. Nestled against the base of a gentle slope was a sprawling ranch house of whitewashed wood, with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a large barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and various sheds. In the distance, cattle grazed in fenced pastures, small dark shapes against the golden grass. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed. The ranch had grown considerably since she'd last seen it, when it had been little more than a modest cabin and a few corrals. "Papa built this?" Abigail asked, awestruck by the scope of the property. "With these two hands," Grant confirmed, "and a lot of help from good men. My father started with just 100 acres and a dream. Now we run cattle on 5,000 acres with 20 hands in peak season." He flicked the reins and the horses moved forward, taking them down the slope toward the ranch house. As they approached, a figure appeared on the porch, a woman in a practical cotton dress, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a simple knot. "Is that grandmother?" Abigail asked, bouncing on the seat. "That's her," Grant confirmed, "and she's been waiting a very long time to meet you." Martha Hawkins was a handsome woman in her early 60s, with the same striking blue eyes as her son and granddaughter. She stood tall and straight as the buggy pulled up to the house, but Lillian could see the emotion working in her face. "Martha," Lillian greeted her formally, uncertain of her welcome despite Grant's assurances. "None of that," Martha said firmly, stepping forward to enfold Lillian in a warm embrace. "Your family now, always have been, as far as I'm concerned." When she released Lillian, her attention turned to Abigail, who was regarding her new grandmother with shy curiosity from her perch in the buggy. "And who might this young lady be?" Martha asked, though she clearly knew the answer. "I'm Abigail Ellis," the child announced, "but Papa says my name should be Abigail Hawkins because he's my papa." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "He's right about that." "May I help you down, Miss Abigail Hawkins?" Abigail nodded regally and allowed Martha to lift her from the buggy. Once on solid ground, she studied her grandmother with the directness of childhood. "You don't look very old," she announced. "Mama said grandmothers are very old ladies with white hair." Martha laughed, a rich, warm sound that reminded Lillian of Grant. "Well, I'm old enough to be your grandmother, but not so old that I can't keep up with a lively girl like you. Would you like to see your room? I've put some special things in there just for you." Abigail's eyes lit up and she slipped her small hand into Martha's. "Yes, please." As Martha led Abigail into the house, chattering about the toy rocking horse and bookshelf of children's stories awaiting her, Grant turned to Lillian. "Welcome home," he said softly. Lillian looked at the ranch house, so much grander than she remembered, a testament to Grant's hard work and success, and felt a moment of panic. "I don't belong here, Grant. This is your world, not mine." "It's our world now," he corrected gently. "Yours, mine, and Abigail's. And my mother's too, I suppose, though she's threatening to move to the Dower House now that you're here." "Dower House," Grant gestured to a small cottage visible beyond the kitchen garden. "Built it last year, thinking she might want her own space eventually. But she won't go unless you want her to. She's determined not to be the interfering mother-in-law of legend." "Mother-in-law," Lillian echoed, her heart skipping. "Grant, we haven't, I know," he interrupted. "I'm getting ahead of myself, but I hope, Lily, I hope that someday soon you might consider making this arrangement permanent. Legal marriage." The word hung unspoken between them, laden with promise and possibility. "Let's take it slowly," Lillian said, though her heart raced at the thought. "For Abigail's sake." "She's had so many changes already." Grant nodded, though she could see the disappointment he tried to hide. "Of course, we have time." The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Abigail took to ranch life with the adaptability of childhood, quickly becoming a favorite among the hands, who taught her to gather eggs and feed the chickens. Martha doted on her granddaughter, reading to her for hours and teaching her to make simple biscuits in the large ranch kitchen. Lillian found her own place more slowly. She took over management of the household accounts, discovering a talent for organization that complemented Grant's more freewheeling approach to business. She began sewing again, first making curtains for Abigail's room, then accepting small commissions from neighboring ranchers' wives who had heard of her skill with a needle. And each evening, after Abigail was tucked into bed in her new room, Lillian and Grant would sit on the porch, watching the stars emerge, talking of everything and nothing. Slowly, they relearned each other, discovering the ways they had changed during their years apart and the essential ways they remained the same. One evening in late September, with the first hint of frost in the air, Grant suggested a ride to check on a pregnant mare in the south pasture. "She's due any day now," he explained. "Thought Abigail might like to see the foal if it's come." They rode out together, Abigail perched before Grant on his saddle, Lillian on a gentle mare that Martha had insisted was perfect for a lady rider. The south pasture was a good hour's ride from the main house, a secluded valley with a small stream running through it ideal for a mare about to foal. The mare hadn't delivered yet, but seemed restless, pacing the boundaries of the small corral Grant had built for her confinement. "Won't be long now," he predicted, helping Abigail down to get a closer look at the expectant mother. "See how her sides are drawn up? That's a sign the foal is positioning itself to be born." Abigail watched, fascinated, as Grant explained the signs of imminent birth. Lillian hung back, ostensibly to hold the horses, but in truth to observe father and daughter together. In just a few weeks, they had developed a bond that seemed to transcend the years of separation. Grant was a natural father patient, attentive, firm when needed but never harsh. As twilight descended, they decided to head back to the ranch house. "We can check on her again tomorrow," Grant promised Abigail. "Maybe by then you'll have a new foal to name." "Can I name it anything I want?" Abigail asked as Grant lifted her back onto his saddle. "Within reason," he hedged, clearly envisioning the possibility of a horse named after one of the fanciful characters in Abigail's storybooks. They were halfway back to the ranch when the first raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, a full-fledged thunderstorm was upon them, the kind that swept across the plains with little warning, bringing lightning and driving rain. "There's a line shack just over that rise," Grant shouted over the thunder. "We can wait it out there." They urged their horses forward, reaching the small cabin just as the heavens truly opened. The line shack was basic, but found a single room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. Grant quickly started a fire while Lillian helped Abigail out of her wet jacket and wrapped her in a blanket from the bed. "An adventure," Abigail declared, her eyes bright with excitement rather than fear. "Like in my books." "Just like in your books," Grant agreed, hanging their wet outer garments near the stove to dry. "Though I hope this adventure doesn't involve any villains or wild animals." As the storm raged outside, they made themselves comfortable. Grant found a deck of cards in a drawer and taught Abigail to play a simple game of matching pairs. Lillian discovered supplies in a cupboard and made a pot of coffee for the adults and warm milk with honey for Abigail. By the time the storm began to abate, Abigail was yawning widely, her excitement giving way to exhaustion. Grant settled her on the narrow bed, tucking the blanket around her with practiced care. "Will we be sleeping here tonight, Papa?" she asked sleepily. "Looks that way, Princess." "The creek will be too high to cross safely in the dark, but we'll head home first thing in the morning." "Like camping," Abigail murmured, her eyes already closing. "Mama, will you and Papa sleep here too?" Lillian felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Yes, sweetheart, we'll be right here if you need us." Within minutes, Abigail was asleep, her breathing deep and even. Lillian and Grant moved to the table by the window, speaking in low voices to avoid waking her. "She's a remarkable child," Grant said, his eyes on his sleeping daughter. "So brave and curious." "You've done a wonderful job with her, Lily." "Thank you," Lillian said softly, "but she's thriving here in a way she never did in Boston. She needs this place, and she needs you." Grant's hand found hers across the table. "And what about you, Lily? What do you need?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving a washed, clean world under a canopy of stars visible through the window. "I need to know that this is real," Lillian whispered. "That I'm not going to wake up tomorrow in my narrow bed in Boston, dreaming of what might have been." Grant's fingers tightened around hers. "It's real, we're real, and I'm not letting you go again, Lillian Ellis, not for anything in this world." "I was so afraid," she confessed. Afraid you'd hate me when you learned what I'd kept from you. Afraid you'd reject us both. Never. The word was a vow, spoken with such conviction that Lillian felt it resonate in her very bones. I could never hate you, Lily, and I could never reject my own child. Or the woman I've loved since we were both too young to know what love meant. He rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. In the dim light of the single lantern, his eyes were dark, intent on her face. I had a speech prepared, he said wryly. Was going to take you up to Lookout Point at sunset, get down on one knee, do it all proper, but I don't want to wait another day. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. This was my grandmother's, he explained, tipping a delicate gold ring with a small but perfect diamond into his palm. My father gave it to me before he died, said to save it for the right woman. Lillian's breath caught as Grant dropped to one knee before her, the ring held between his thumb and forefinger. Lillian Ellis, I've loved you since we were children. I never stopped loving you, not even when I thought I'd lost you forever. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife, of making our family complete? Tears blurred Lillian's vision as she looked down at the man she'd loved and lost and found again. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Grant Hawkins, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her, and rose to take her in his arms. Their kiss was gentle at first, a reacquainting after years apart, but quickly deepened into something more urgent, more primal. Lily, Grant murmured against her lips. My Lily. A small voice from the bed interrupted them. Are you and Mama getting married, Papa? They broke apart, turning to find Abigail watching them with sleepy interest, propped up on one elbow. Yes, sweetheart, Grant told her, his arm still around Lillian's waist. Your Mama has agreed to marry me. Is that all right with you? Abigail considered this seriously. Will we still live at the ranch, of course, and will I still get to help with the new foal? Grant chuckled. Absolutely. Then it's all right, Abigail decided, lying back down. Good night, Mama. Good night, Papa. Good night, Princess, they chorused, exchanging amused glances over their daughter's practical concerns. They married 2 weeks later in the small church in Broken Ridge, with Martha as witness and Abigail as an impromptu flower girl, scattering petals from Martha's prized rose bushes. The entire town turned out for the celebration afterward, a testament to the Hawkins family's standing in the community and perhaps to the romantic notion of separated lovers reunited. Lillian wore a gown of ivory silk that she'd sewn herself, with Martha's help. Grant wore a new black suit ordered from Denver, looking so handsome that Lillian's heart skipped when she first saw him waiting for her at the altar. The reception was held at the Double H, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns hanging from the trees. There was music and dancing, and enough food to feed an army, courtesy of Martha and the neighboring ranchers' wives. As the evening deepened, Grant found Lillian sitting alone on the porch swing, watching the celebration from a slight distance. Mrs. Hawkins, he greeted her, settling beside her on the swing. May I say how beautiful you look tonight? You may, Mr. Hawkins, she replied with a smile, though I think your judgment may be somewhat biased. Hopelessly, he agreed, taking her hand. The gold band on her finger caught the lantern light, a tangible symbol of promises made and kept. Happy, more than I ever thought possible. Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that we're here together with our daughter. Believe it, Grant said, pressing a kiss to her temple. This is just the beginning, Lily. We have our whole lives ahead of us. From the yard came a burst of laughter. Abigail was being swung between Martha and one of the ranch hands, her face alight with joy. Look at her, Lillian said softly. So happy, so free. This is where she belongs. Where we all belong, Grant corrected. Together. As autumn gave way to winter, the Hawkins family settled into a rhythm. Grant ran the ranch with the help of his capable foreman, expanding their breeding program with new bloodlines purchased from a Kentucky breeder. Lillian established herself as the ranch's mistress, managing the household and continuing her sewing business, which had grown to include custom dresses for most of the county's leading ladies. Abigail thrived, growing like a weed and developing a passionate interest in horses, particularly the filly born that night during the thunderstorm. She named the foal Stormy, and under Grant's watchful eye began learning to ride on a gentle pony Martha gave her for Christmas. By spring, Lillian had news of her own. On a mild April evening, with the first wildflowers beginning to carpet the hills, she told Grant that Abigail would have a sibling by winter. Grant's reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and a fiercely protective tenderness that manifested in his insistence that she rest more and let him take over some of her duties. "I'm pregnant, not ill," she protested when he tried to prevent her from helping with the spring cleaning. "Humor me," he said, stealing a kiss as he took the broom from her hands. "I missed everything with Abigail. Let me fuss over you this time." Martha was equally delighted by the prospect of another grandchild, though she took a more practical approach than her son. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she told Grant when he expressed concern about Lillian riding to town for supplies. "And Lillian's as healthy as a horse. Stop hovering." November brought an early snowfall and with it the birth of their son. Samuel Richard Hawkins arrived after a mercifully short labor, with Martha serving as midwife and Grant pacing the porch with Abigail, both of them pretending not to be terrified by the sounds coming from the bedroom. When Martha finally called them in, they found Lillian propped up on pillows, tired but radiant, a small bundle in her arms. "Come meet your son," she told Grant, whose face transformed with wonder as he approached the bed. "He's perfect," Grant whispered, gently taking the swaddled infant from Lillian. "Look at him, Abigail, your baby brother." Abigail, who had been prepared for this moment with careful explanations about babies and their care, stood on tiptoe to peer at the red, wrinkled face. "He doesn't look like much," she observed critically, the adults laughed, tension broken by the child's frank assessment. "He'll grow," Grant assured her, "and you'll be the best big sister any boy could ask for." As winter settled over the Double H, the Hawkins family drew close around their hearth. Each evening found them gathered in the parlor, Grant reading aloud from one of his beloved books of poetry or adventure, Lillian sewing tiny garments for Samuel, Abigail playing with her dolls on the rug, and Martha knitting by the fire. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and the house fragrant with pine boughs and cinnamon, Grant found Lillian in the nursery, humming softly as she rocked Samuel to sleep. "He's finally out," she whispered as Grant came to stand beside her. "Took 3 verses of Silent Night and 2 of Away in a Manger. He's stubborn," Grant observed with a father's pride, "like his mother." "And his father," Lillian countered, carefully laying the sleeping infant in his cradle. Abigail asleep. Out like a light, surrounded by the new paper doll's mother gave her. She made me promise we'd wake her at first light to open presents. Lillian smiled, thinking of the rag doll she'd sewn for her daughter, the miniature saddle Grant had commissioned from the leather worker in town, the books and sweets and small treasures hidden away for the morning's celebration. "I have something for you," Grant said, taking her hand and leading her to the window. Outside, the world was transformed by snow, the familiar landscape rendered new and magical in its white blanket. "Can't wrap it, I'm afraid." Lillian looked at him curiously. "What is it?" "A name," he said simply. "For the place where we found each other again, where I first saw my daughter," understanding dawned. "The creek," Grant nodded. "I had the surveyor out last week. It's official now, Ellis Creek, named for the woman who changed my life." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes. "Grant, that's the most beautiful gift anyone's ever given me." "Not quite," he disagreed, drawing her into his arms. "The most beautiful gift you gave me, our daughter, our son, this life we're building together." As they stood by the window, watching the snow fall on their land, their home, Lillian thought of all the twists and turns, the mistakes and second chances that had brought them to this moment. 4 years ago, she had fled this place, carrying a secret and a broken heart. Now she had returned, found forgiveness and love, and built a family stronger than she'd ever dared to dream. "I love you, Grant Hawkins," she whispered against his chest, "today and all the days to come." "And I love you, Lillian Hawkins," he replied, tilting her face up for a kiss that held the promise of their future, a future as vast and full of possibility as the Montana sky above their home. In the nursery, Samuel sighed in his sleep. Down the hall, Abigail dreamed of Christmas morning and ponies and the adventures to come. And in the heart of the Double H Ranch, beside a window framing the snowy landscape, Grant and Lillian Hawkins held each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them full circle, back to the land they loved and the family they had created together. Years would pass, seasons would change, more children would join their family twin girls who arrived 2 years after Samuel, a final son born when Abigail was 10. The Double H would prosper, weathering droughts and harsh winters, market fluctuations and the gradual taming of the frontier around them. But through it all, Grant and Lillian would return to Ellis Creek each summer on the anniversary of their reunion, sometimes alone, sometimes with their children, to remember the day when a cowboy met his daughter by the water's edge and found his heart restored to him, complete and overflowing with love. And in the quiet of those moments, with the creek bubbling over stones that had witnessed their youthful promises and their adult reconciliation, they would renew the vow they had made to each other to cherish each day they had been given, to never again let pride or fear come between them, and to face whatever life brought them the way they faced everything now, together.